This session is really building on the last two, where we're talking about platforms and their future. And I think it goes without saying that from everything we've heard already, the old idea of a platform as a neutral thing that content can happily and neutrally be built upon, is under severe challenge at the moment. And that's one of the tectonic shifts that's going on. I mean, it's interesting if you look in the dictionary, there are two definitions of platform. One is this neutral raised surface that you stand on. The other is the content that a political party runs on. And I think what we've done is seen the two things come together in a rather unexpected way over the past year in the tech community. So we have two speakers who, I guess, have a lot to say about this subject, not least because they have Android in common, which was mentioned in the last panel. You were there, Christopher, at the launch of the Android 10 years ago, and I want to start with you. What's to you is the biggest tectonic shift going on in a platform compared to that sort of idealism of 10 years ago?
Well, kind of, if we step back a little bit, right, and look at the last 10 years of the internet, it's really the mobile internet, right? As you said, Matthew, stood in a New York underground, station together with Larry Page, Sergey Brin, of course, Andy Rubin, the godfather of Android, launching this platform, I think, in September 2008. And we had a bit of a shaky operating system called Android, and we had 4 apps on that platform. There was a German, Hamburg-origined taxi-hailing app. There was a barcode reader and 2 others. And that is kind of how this all started. And 10 years, further, I look at what you're running as the Google Play Store, something with 3.5 million apps out there, and the world has dramatically changed. However, I think we are changing also the paradigm, because this system, which has served us so well in terms of changing the internet, has come to kind of a couple of bottlenecks. And I think 2 of them are the really major ones. There still is an affordability theme with the internet. That is the reason why only 4 billion out of 8 billion people are connected, because the internet and connectivity is still expensive. But second, and much more important, the internet is still complicated to users. Users have theoretically millions of apps out there, but the reality of users is that they are using free apps for 80% of their time. And if you look at 10 apps, that almost is, explaining 97% of internet usage. And that leads to, 5 Silicon Valley companies now being in the top 10 of market cap leagues, and another 2 to 3 Chinese companies being there, because they monopolize kind of the, internet experience we have. And here comes AI. And a new type of internet, a contextual internet, I would argue, which is changing the game, and that's where I do see the tectonic shift of platforms.
And just spell that out a bit. I mean, what potentially does AI do to our definition of platform and some of the issues that we've been talking about already this morning in terms of whether we can trust the neutrality of a platform?
Well, so far we're forcing users into a know, right? They have to know which apps exist. They have to train themselves to actually, operate an app, and that is not so easy for users. And in the future, I do see, of course, assisted kinds of internet where people are just served by something in a protected and dignified way by the internet, where an agent comes in knowing my situation, my certain context, and what I would like to actually do. And that internet is more convenient, but it poses, of course, also the question of how we deal with privacy.
So, Punima, you actually are running part of Android, so what do you feel about that? I mean, do you feel there are tectonic shifts underway in the platform world?
Well, we just closed a wonderful year. Lots of developers doing well and building really amazing businesses. So with that as context, I think there is 3 things to think about. 1, users have always wanted choice. And so when the apps came around, people said, is the web dead? And we actually find equal number of people using the web. We are very excited about the assistant technologies, as you know. And so the thing to think about when you sit in this room and you think about, is it app, is it web, or is it an assistant, is to figure out where is your management mind share. Each of this is a channel. The channel has to be fostered, and that channel has to be built. So when we talk to developers and they think about which technology am I going to use, the question we always ask them is, where are your users and where are you spending the time? So yesterday, when Christopher sent me, this thing is like, "Our app's dead," and all of you should do this, just Google, right? "Our app's dead," and you'll find everything from 2011 onwards, people saying that they are or they're dying. And I think there have been similar predictions about web. And so the way I sit and look at it is that users want choice, and we provide choice. We did 3 things in terms of, even in between. One, what we realize is where people find things. I know Christopher talked about discovery, and we found that people discover apps in many different places. And we support that. So for example, a year ago, we announced instant apps, which means if you go and search on the web for a certain kind of thing, say, where can I find taxis in Munich, or maybe even electric scooters in Munich, you will know that there is an ME app. And if it's an instant app, you could actually click on it without needing to download and find it. That's an example of trying to bridge across these technologies.
But does that feel tectonic to you in terms of, is this a massive shift underway, or does this just feel evolutionary?
For anything to be tectonic, and Christopher, maybe the question to ask is, what happened from the point you stood in the underground where there were 4 apps to where we are today? What needed to happen? And 3 big things needed to happen, and I think that's something that Christopher's organization is trying to work on. Number 1, we had to come up with a design language that everybody understands. Humans don't like to feel ill-equipped. So design guidelines became the first thing. Discovery distribution was the second thing. And the third is commercial models became the third thing. So we had to figure out those 3 things. And I think for the tectonic shift to happen for assistants, I think conversational UIs have to be defined. How you get discovery has to be defined in terms of knowing what a user wants, what is my preferences versus Christopher's versus Matthew's preferences, and then how do you complete transactions seamlessly needs to be figured out. And so I feel it is an exciting space. I think it'll be some time, and we are very excited and obviously very invested in it.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, this phrase, "what users want," I think it seems to have similar kind of neutral and sort of feel to it, to the basic notion that the tech industry has always had about platforms, which is we're creating neutral places. Whereas, in fact, I suppose coming at this as an economist and someone familiar with a lot of the sort of behavioral studies of consumers and the neuroscience associated with that. I mean, it seems that actually one of the things we know about users is that generally they don't know what they want, and often what they want is quite bad for them. And so I suppose, what we're seeing in this last year is that really coming to a head. The tech industry, is being called on more and more to actually make a choice between selling what consumers would buy because they don't know what they want and what's good for them, and actually taking an ethical leadership position on making sure that they're not selling harmful stuff to the consumer because the consumer will take it. And I suppose as we think about AI being applied to this, it's certainly possible to imagine that the opportunities to sell people what we know they will take, but which isn't good for them, is going to be orders of magnitude increased over the next few years. So how do the platforms, make sure they don't end up, with probably the class action to end all class actions in a few years' time when it turns out that they've completely destroyed children's brains by sort of sending them addictive substance on their iPhones and so forth? I mean, how does the industry get ahead of that and take a responsible position to make sure that they are being good for consumer rather than harmful to consumer?
I think it's the most important debate we have to have, right, in terms of really creating an information society we all want to live in a way. What users want today is interesting, something very simple. They want to talk to each other, right? If you look at the last 5 years, conversational platforms like Simply Messaging are those platforms creating the most user engagement on earth, right? It is Facebook going to Facebook Messenger. It's, of course, WhatsApp and the Chinese phenomenon of WeChat, which is creating a context, because we all creating a context when we talk to each other, right? If the 3 of us would, say we go for dinner tonight, that single sentence says we would need to go there in terms of a taxi hailing thing or taking public transport. We need a table, you know, booking in Munich. We need a calendar entry. And that context of this sentence could command services in a magic way that I don't have to know that taxi hailing apps exist out there or an app called Open Table exists, right? So the conversation is what users want. And now you are asking how we deal with that privacy protection and really also with platforms which are kind of serving humanity instead of, you know, taking the human element away. And I would argue for a couple of things. First of all, a really thorough privacy protection, which is transactional. Not go to terms and conditions once. Are you going to share location, identity, authentication forever with that application? Can I access your contacts, your camera? No, I want to be asked in a certain context that only for that transaction my data is being shared in a certain way which I can even control with technical means, and then it vanishes again. Like in Snapchat, a photo is vanishing after the transaction, which I look at, right? So this is an important part. And we do have the technical means for that, you know, as an industry. We have things like, of course, end-to-end encryption. We have tokenization, where I don't share a credit card with a service, but just a 16-digit code of zeros and ones with an Uber, right, where I go there, where I have, you know, trusted computing modules in an edge device, which, you know, does not go to a server and leave data behind, footprints like that. So the internet is kind of broken around that. Look at the last edition of Wired, where the founders like Sir Tim Berners-Lee or Windsurf do argue that their own creation is broken. It's not broken in terms of the creativity and that magical innovation we've seen. It's broken in terms of taking users seriously.
How do you respond to that?
Well, you know, I see a slightly different world, and, you know, we work very actively. First of all, I want to make sure that everybody understands that user safety is paramount. You know, we have both human curation as well as machine learning and AI to try to take bad stuff out as quickly as possible. Human behavior takes time. People want comfort in how they do things. So, for example, in India, it is not about poor people having no credit cards and rich people having credit cards. Cash is a very big way of how people transact. So when commerce application had to come out in India, they had to do cash on delivery. That means you order something, somebody brings it to your home. And also there's a little bit of skepticism because they've not always had transactional, I suppose, integrity. So they open up and see is the right thing come there, and they pay cash. Right? So we found that how people pay, what they pay for, is very cultural. In Japan, for example, people had NTT Docomo, and they actually trust the telecom to hold all their transactional information because they bought content on NTT Docomo's service. And so direct carrier billing is actually a preferred mode for all kinds of transactions. So I do believe that it is an evolution. We get better at it as we go along. And iteratively, we learn how to create better services. So for example, one of the things we have done on the other side is, on the user side, is to make runtime permissions so that the permissions are offered during runtime. And I think, as you're talking, Christopher, is that it's a point in evolution to actually make it better and better. What I love about where I sit is that there are super creative people who are willing to invest to make platforms better all the time. And it's that collective wisdom that makes it a very humbling experience for me on a daily basis about the work I do. It's people investing in making Android better. It's Stack Overflow, folks sitting to debug it for humans. It is GDGs and GDEs, community groups coming together to help entrepreneurs. And that collectively, we will get to that wonderful vision that Christopher has laid out for us.
But if you buy that vision that essentially the big value opportunity is in contextualization and being proactive as a provider to actually help people live their lives much more effectively, what are the things that you have to do to make sure that people can trust the contextualized information and opportunities that are being offered to them, and make sure that they're not feeling that they're being sold something they don't really want?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I should ask you, do you guys feel that you're being sold something you don't want? Where I sit, I find that developers are building things that are actually enhancing lives of people. I'll just give you a simple example of what happened recently. Maxim May is a young German guy who's on my team. He's from Berlin. He meets this entrepreneur who is running this organization called Share the Meal. Share the Meal helps you, when you eat, you share some things to feed hunger. Maxim initially comes to us and says, we should enable companies like Share the Meal to raise money for things like hunger. And then we thought to ourselves, we could do that and think about users increasing that, or we could just get a whole bunch of developers who build amazing apps and games to come with us in that journey. And what happened is, recently on World Hunger Day, we had a whole group of people come together to create content, and they donated the proceeds for an entire week for hunger. Now, I understand that you're asking, what can we do contextually in terms of technically, what are the things that we're doing? We are applying machine learning, we are applying AI to get these things to get smarter and better. But at the same time, I'm also thinking that there is lots of really great people out there who are coming together to solve real problems.
Christopher, what do you feel are the top 3 things that have to be done to sort of give this contextualized platform, a reason to be trusted?
Well, first of all, we need to be fully dedicated to innovation, right, and research. There's no doubt, right? We can solve, societal problems by means of technology. I'm an optimist on that, angle. That is absolutely clear. We have the means to do so, but at the same time, we need to be kind of careful with the model. Talked about privacy. I'd like to talk about one more thing, which is really, how we are funding the internet in essence. And if you look at predominant platforms like Google and Facebook run today, they are, of course, all advertising financed, right? And if you're advertising financed, at the end of the day, you are endangered to kind of compromise on privacy and user interests. And if these 2 companies really dominate online advertising, right? For 40% of advertising today is online, 84% of online advertising is with 2 companies in Silicon Valley and growing. I'd like to ask the question whether internet can only be advertising funded, or we need to reverse the equation and think about models where, a consumer, first of all, is in control of data. Some visionaries of the internet 20 years ago argued the user should be paid for data, right, at the end of the day in that equation. And there's other models. So in our platform, our WeOn platform, we're today serving 240 million telco customers, especially in emerging markets, and we've created kind of a free messaging system which does not even consume data on the telco bill and is always running to have some inclusion for people. We have banned advertising as a revenue stream, as a strategic decision of the company, not even to go there and find new models where you can kind of protect. And the last question really is, are we on the verge of, like Dr. Cullen has also argued before, of having to have a regulatory debate, right? For instance,
we're going to have it. I mean, it seems inevitable now that there will be serious moves around the world to regulate.
And the topic there very much is the dissemination of social interaction and, of course, branded content.
But what do you think would be sensible regulation?
I think, we need privacy regulation for sure. We have to have that debate, around the planet, so that is clear. And I'm not a media expert, at large like you are, Matthew, for instance, but I do think if we are running in the dilution of quality of the media in a way, like we have seen it in the US in particular, but also in other occasions, we have to look at how the value of journalistic content on the one hand can be separated from branded content, which is of course endangered of being a bit of manipulative in that regard, and where is then social interaction? And these 3 domains require a debate.
I mean, there's some suggestion from academics that we view the big platforms as basically utilities, monopoly utilities, and start putting profit regulation in place, and that might change changed the way they worked and their willingness to sell stuff to people that wasn't necessarily great for them.
You know, a profit regulation or breakup discussions, I think, are premature, but we need to be really committed to the principles like Google is committed, right, of open access, right, of open source principles, of the open internet, and that will further the debate.
I'm going to guess you're not in favor of breakups and profit regulation, but is there any need for a regulatory debate at the moment?
I think with everything, it's a dialogue. With any kind of ecosystem, smart people come together, put their heads together to figure out better solutions. One of the things that I think Christopher talked about is this very important aspect about access and getting access to lots of folks. The question to ask is, what fuels innovation? Christopher has been talking amazing things about his messaging platform. And I would guess that a lot of people are using it on Android devices. And the questions that we have asked ourselves is, how do you make Android accessible to the people in Pakistan and Bangladesh and everywhere else that Christopher is? And so the investment in Android Go to enable those devices enables companies like Christopher's to provide that access. So this is a layered and nuanced conversation. Christopher's stuff would not be possible if Android Go wasn't there, and if Android Go wasn't there, it wouldn't be possible for OEMs in many of these countries to create affordable devices. So I think there is more nuance to this conversation.
So, 10 years ago, Android was launched. Let's roll forward 10 years. Is it going to be the same big platforms dominating around the world? Will they look pretty much the same as they do now, or will they be significantly different, and if so, in what way? And will they be more regulated than today? Christopher? Well,
the big players will be there. Most of them, they will definitely look different, right? Absolutely look different. They have to, and they will evolve into this type of, AI-driven, contextual type of internet. And I really do hope that new players emerge, right? Because otherwise, right, our innovation system would be just, at the end of the day, not working, right? If this is the age where just 5 companies dominate the world from Silicon Valley, and a specific Chinese situation with 3 companies is prevailing, and nobody else is on stage, I think that is not the world I would like to see.
And what about regulation?
I think that is a fundamental challenge for the political arena. It's not easy to regulate the internet because it's a complex thing, right? We do see the political participants in the debate being too slow partly in that discussion, also not stepping up in the right way. And I would argue that the challenge and task of public service is something we also need to embrace, all of us being in the tech industry, because whom are we serving at the end of the day, right? It's a human being in an information society.
Same questions to you, Purnima.
As I said, it's a nuanced conversation. I think there is people who will continue to have that conversation and figure it out.
But will we still have the same big platforms
dominant?
The
same big platform. I have found one thing that is for sure. All my predictions have been wrong until now, right? And so anybody who sits here, and being a Valley person, if I could predict 10 years from now, I wouldn't be here. I'd be raising VC funding and going after building
Let me push you to
future.
be specific on one thing. My old platform, The Economist, has just run a cover story on taming the big platforms. And one of the points that it makes that I'd like your opinion on is that essentially compared to when Microsoft was being subject to antitrust action for the first time at the end of the 90s, it's become much harder to argue that monopolies are contestable than they were then. It was still possible to believe that Microsoft could be replaced, and indeed it was replaced in significant ways by an incoming platform. Yet today it seems much harder to believe that the Googles and Facebooks are going to be removed by a plucky new entrant. How do you feel about that? Is there a significant change in the contestability of these markets?
Not my area of expertise. I don't know. All I do know is on a regular basis, I am on my toes trying to make sure that I can provide the best possible services to the entrepreneurs around the world, and we are constantly innovating, running at 90 miles an hour. I am not sitting around. I work crazy hours. If you can tell me how I can do it without, I would welcome the answers. We are working daily to remain relevant. So that's all I know.
So Christopher, the same to you. I mean, you implied that you hoped there would be more new entrants driving the old platforms out, but do you actually believe it's as possible as it was, say, 10 or 15 years ago?
Absolutely. That's why I'm working, right, on this VM platform. I can tell you we've launched it commercially in September last year. We're now north of the first 8 million kind of downloads, right, in only 4 months. It took us 4 days in Pakistan to be #1 in both app stores, both Google and Apple. It caught like wildfire, so we do see that something is going on and possible.
Well, certainly if that is the case, we can be a lot more optimistic that the tectonic shifts in platforms are going to be pro-consumer. My worry would certainly be that these are going to become more and more entrenched monopolies, and we're going to have to spend a lot more time worrying about how they're regulated and so forth. And we shall see. In 10 years' time, we'll come back and see who was right about that. So I'd like to thank both Purnima and Christopher for a really interesting conversation. Thank you very much.